The two children had also not been able to sleep for hunger, unfortunate as they are in this poor and selfish household, and had heard what their stepmother had said to their father. Gretel wept bitter tears and said to Hansel, "Now all is over with us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Do not distress thyself. I will soon find a way to help us." Now, you see, that contrasts Hansel and Gretel with the stepmother and the woodcutter, the father, because the parents look out for themselves. That's their first impulse, even in a murderous way, whereas Hansel and Gretel make a team, and Hansel's response to Gretel's distress is to say that he will find a way to help the both of them. So he doesn't concern himself with his own immediate survival. He extends a hospitable hand and a brave hand to his sister. And when the old folks had fallen asleep, he got up, put on his little coat, opened the door below, and crept outside. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like real silver pennies. Hansel stooped and put as many of them in the little pocket of his coat as he could possibly get in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep in peace. God will not forsake us." So Hansel is emblematic of the boy who can find the shining path even in the darkness. And he lay down again in his bed. When day dawned, before the sun had risen, the woman came and awoke the two children, saying, "Get up, you sluggards! We are going into the forest to fetch wood." She gave each a little piece of bread and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it up before then, for you will get nothing else." Gretel took the bread under her apron as Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and did so again and again. So he's a thoughtful boy, and he's planning his return home, right? And that's often the end of a story. How do you return home? Like the Hobbit does at the end of the Hobbit and at the end of the Lord of the Rings, right? To wander out into the world and to find your way home transformed. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and did so again and again. His father said, "Hansel, what art thou looking at there and staying behind for? Mind what thou art about. Mind what thou art about, and do not forget how to use thy legs." "Ah, father," said Hansel, "I am looking at my little white cat, which is sitting up on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me." The wife said, "Fool! That is not thy little cat. That is the morning sun which is shining on the chimneys." Hansel, however, had not been looking at the cat, but had been constantly throwing out one of the white pebble stones from his pocket onto the road. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, pile up some wood, and I will light a fire, that you may not be cold." So he's couching his malevolence, his cowardly malevolence, in a facade or patina of benevolence. He's out in the forest taking care of his children, and that's a motif that echoes through this story, the contrast between the false facade of parental, paternal, maternal care and the underlying malevolent reality. Hansel and Gretel gathered brushwood together as high as a little hill. The brushwood was lighted, and when the flames were burning very high, the woman said, "Now, children, lay yourself down by the fire and rest. We will go into the forest and cut some wood. When we have done, we will come back and fetch you away." So the same thing, another sign of persona, another sign of virtue signaling, another sign of false morality, another indication, you might say, of it's a variant of using God's name in vain, the acting out of a claim to moral virtue. Obviously, the woodcutter and his wife are just being good parents, taking care of the children, while pursuing their own narrow, selfish, and even malevolent aims. Very bad. Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, each ate a little piece of bread. And as they heard the strokes of the wood axe, they believed that their father was near, so they'd been lulled into a false sense of security. it was not, which is that's another indication of the depth of the betrayal, right? So the stepmother and the weak father set their children up to assume that they're safe in the darkest place of the woods, but they've skittered off and left them to their own devices. When they heard the strokes of the wood axe, they believed that the father was near. It was not, however, the axe. It was a branch which he had fastened to a withered tree, which the wind was blowing backwards and forwards. So that's another indication of his treachery and malevolence in the service of his cruel and heartless stepmother/wife. He's actually set up an additional trick to lull his children into a sense of security so they won't follow and will stay lost in the forest. And as they had been sitting such a long time, their eyes shut with fatigue, and they fell fast asleep. When at last they awoke, it was already dark night. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we to get out of the forest now?" But Hansel comforted her and said, "Just wait a little until the moon had risen, and then we will soon find the way." And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like newly coined silver pieces, and showed them the way. They walked the whole night long. So again, you can see that Hansel is taking care of Gretel and making manifest that spirit of reciprocity and mature care that actually saves the children in the final analysis and contrasts them quite dramatically with the appalling conduct of their parents. They walked the whole night long, and by break of day came once more to their father's house. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, lying immediately, as is her nature. So, and that pertains to what we discussed before, the reasons for her poverty. She's cruel and selfish and prone continually to deceit. And no doubt she believes that the world is a hard place, dooming someone like her to abject poverty such that she can't feed herself, her husband, and the children who aren't her children. But given her character, her socioeconomic circumstances are hardly surprising. "You naughty children, why have you slept so long in the forest? We thought you were never coming back at all." The father, however, rejoiced, for it had cut him to the heart to leave them behind alone. Yeah, well, it might have cut him to the heart, but he didn't do much about it. Not long afterwards, there was once more great scarcity in all parts, and the children heard their mother saying at night to their father, "Everything is eaten again. We have 1/2 loaf left, and after that there is an end. Those children must go. We will take them farther into the wood, so that they will not find their way out again. There is no other means of saving ourselves." Well, so the children have managed to fend for themselves quite adequately at this point, following the silver road back home, in consequence of Hansel's positive conduct, his attentive attitude, and his willingness to take care of his sister. But they are just children, and so it's possible for the adults to circumvent even the wisest actions of children and betray them effectively, which is what happens next. The man's heart was heavy, and he thought, "It would be better for thee to share the last mouthful with thy children." Yeah, you think? The woman, however, would listen to nothing that he had to say, but scolded and reproached him. And then the author adds a comment. "He who says A must say B likewise, and as he had yielded the first time, he had to do so a second time also." Well, his wife pokes and prods him to find his weakness of character, and once having established that initially, she knows the points to leverage, and so does that again. And the authors make reference to the fact that once you've given up in relationship to a fundamental principle the first time, it's much more likely that you'll do the same the second time. The children, however, were still awake and had heard the conversation. When the old folks were asleep, Hansel again got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles, as he had done before. But the woman had locked the door, and Hansel could not get out. Nonetheless, he comforted his little sister and said, "Do not cry, Gretel. Go to sleep quietly. The good God will help us." So Hansel is also a boy of some upward orientation and faith. And that makes itself manifest in his attitude of reciprocity towards his sister, which, as we said, contrasts with the parents, but also turns out to be the saving grace in the story. Early in the morning came the woman and took the children out of their beds. Their bit of bread was given to them, but it was still smaller than the time before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his in his pocket and often stood still and threw a morsel on the ground. So he's trying a variant of the same strategy that he used last time, to leave a pathway so that when his parents lose him purposefully, he still has the wherewithal to get home. And he's also willing to sacrifice his meal to ensure that the future remains secure and predictable. And that shows a kind of preternatural maturity on his part, because he's a hungry child after all, a starving child even in dire straits, and he still has enough self-control and discipline to sacrifice his bit of bread to ensure that his sister and himself can make their way home. So that's also a testament to Hansel's character.